right. Well, it's 5:30, so I guess we'll get started.
Okay.
Thank you to everyone that's here. I am so excited for tonight's webinar. Thank you to Dan for being our IT guy. Great job thus far. Nothing crazy has happened. So welcome to our kickoff event for the education portion of the Finland Food Chain's Wild Rice Project. My name is Abby Roweeder, and I am the Wild Rice Project Coordinator, and I am so excited that you all are here. For those not familiar with Zoom, or if you're watching from Facebook, I apologize. I'm going to go through a little bit of Zoom troubleshooting if you are not familiar with it. For those of you that got here, that's a good start. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little microphone, and so that is a mute button. From us kind of playing around, it sounds like you are not able to unmute, but just in case, to prevent any interference, please keep your audio muted, especially while Dr. O'Neill is presenting, so that we don't have any background noise or interference. I also see a chat function, so if at all during this webinar, my introduction, anytime, if you have any questions, please send those via the chat box, and I will read them off throughout the presentation, and then we'll also have a Q&A portion at the end. So those are kind of the two options that we will have. I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about the Wild Rice Project as a whole. And before I get into it, I just want to extend recognition of the original stewards of the land that is now our project area and our home, the Anishinaabe peoples. This northeastern Minnesota region was ceded to the United States government under the Treaty of La Pointe in 1854 from the Anishinaabe people. So I just wanted to make sure that was recognized. There are three primary focuses of this project. So we are processing wild rice, establishing a mentorship program for a wild rice harvest season, and education and outreach. So the Wild Rice House, I had the logo behind me for a while, but it didn't really work. The background, you couldn't see my canoe paddle earrings, so didn't work out. But is our processing facility. So it is in the downtown of the booming metropolis that is Finland, Minnesota. And it is our processing facility created for all of the small scale ricers in the region to have a place nearby for their rice to be processed. The Wild Rice House also serves as an educational space for teaching and mentoring about how wild rice goes from the canoe to the mouths of families. So it's a space for people to learn and to process the wonderful thing that is Manoomin. So we'll actually begin processing on a 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. schedule on Monday. So very exciting stuff. We're getting into the wild rice harvest season right now. Sounds like central Minnesota is getting some pretty good batches of rice already. So more information on our website. It's finlandwildrice.com, and I can put that in the chat for you to visit, but there's more information there if you want to know more about the processing facility. The mentorship program connects a mentee, somebody that wants to learn more about ricing and wild rice, with an experienced ricer to teach them how to harvest wild rice and how that process works. We connect them and show them how to make their own rice knockers. So the two sticks that you use to get the rice off of the stalk, push poles that are used to push the canoe, and we get them out on the water to try it out and experience it. This builds community as well as instills a sense of understanding on where rice comes from and why its environment must be restored and protected, because there are a lot of waters in Minnesota that need to be restored, that are definitely having a rough time right now. So as I said earlier, tonight kicks off the education module portion of the project. And so this portion of the project will be webinars such as this one, guest speaking at local schools and learning centers, giving tours of the processing facility, hosting cooking classes with wild rice as the main ingredient. Our goal is to provide education spanning all the way from the history of wild rice, the good and the bad, in our region, and from the pathology of the plant itself, the fact that it's an aquatic grass and not even a rice at all, just to how to cook the rice and its amazing nutritional properties. That's tonight's discussion. And so speaking of nutrition of wild rice, I'm super excited to introduce Dr. Emily Onello. Let's see here. I lost my Zoom. Oh no, oh there it is, okay. There she is. Dr. Anella received her medical training at the Mayo Medical School and completed a residency in family medicine in 1998 at the Mayo Graduate School of Medicine in Rochester, Minnesota. She's a family physician who has practiced with underserved populations in both rural and urban settings. Since 2012, she has been a member of the faculty of the University of Minnesota Medical School's Duluth campus, so UMD. There, her work has focused on training future physicians for medical practice in rural and tribal communities. Her research interests gravitate towards issues that can influence the health of rural and tribal communities, including food access, security, distribution, and quality. So current evidence suggests that wild rice or Manoomin has significant health benefits, which I mean, we all knew that already, but Dr. Anella's scholarly work has included studying the individual and community health benefits of wild rice consumption. So she was honored to participate in the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior Chippewa's 2018 Landmark Health Impact Assessment entitled Expanding the Narrative of Tribal Health, the Effects of Wild Rice Water Quality, Rule Changes on Tribal Health. She is currently involved in several collaborative research projects that examine nutritional and cancer-preventing aspects of wild rice. And so without further ado, I will pass it over to Dr. Ornello, and let's learn about the nutrition of Manoomin, shall we?
Great. Thank you so much, Abby, for that beautiful introduction. I'm hoping I was smooth there in my transition to the slide deck. Can that be seen now? Okay. Yeah, well, welcome. I'm so delighted to be giving this presentation. As I reflected on the time spot of 5:30, I sort of had this vision of all the listeners in their kitchen listening to this webinar and perhaps even cooking their own Manoomin at home and making dinner. So hopefully you're able to do that, if not tonight, sometime soon. So as Abby mentioned, I was invited to share what I've learned about the nutrition of Manoomin, and I am a family physician, so nutrition and food science and biochemistry are things I'm interested in, but not certainly expert in. And so I'm really excited to kind of walk through this together and learn from each other. I think there was a comment made. I do welcome your questions either during or, of course, at the end of the presentation. So hopefully today, from our session today, you'll come away with three things that you can keep with you. I'd like to first take us through kind of the nutrition label approach to wild rice, compare it a little bit to other rices with which you may be familiar, and then a little bit beyond just the nutrition label approach, but to some other aspects of wild rice. And then hopefully what I can bring to the discussion as a physician is where our Western science models and experiments have led us in terms of what we know about potential health benefits of consuming wild rice. And then lastly, share a little bit about where we are right now and where the current research is taking us. So those are the highlights of my talk today. Abby told you a little bit about me. Some of you may know me well from my time in Lake County, but I'm a family medicine physician and I did practice in Silver Bay for some time. I'm now a medical educator working with medical students. And really my scholarly interest is, as you heard earlier, in preserving, studying, and advocating for natural wild rice stands. So I'd like to start with some basics really quickly. I'm fairly confident the audience here is familiar with this, but just as you mentioned, that wild rice is an aquatic plant. It is annual, so it sort of self-seeds. And in this diagram here, you can see we're coming around to the summer and autumn interface there, where the plants are ready for harvest, and that panicle at the top, sort of that fan-like areas where the rice seeds mature and ultimately fall off. There are several Zizania species, but the Zizania palustris is the species of wild rice that we see most in the Great Lakes region. And interestingly, even within that species of Zizania palustris, we think there's a fair amount of natural genetic variability, which is really interesting and potentially an area of further study. Continuing, most of you know that wild rice is considered a whole grain, meaning it hasn't been refined, that you're eating a lot of the components, the germ, and all these wonderfully healthy parts. As a whole grain, you see the bullet points there. You're getting the benefit of dietary fibers, vitamins, minerals, and then some more esoteric things that are contained in plants, lignans, phytosterols, antioxidant, phenolic compounds, and things like that. So that speaks to the complexity of consuming this plant, is that there's a lot of wonderful things to think about and study. It is a gluten-free food, and as you may know, about 1 out of every 140 Americans have a disease called celiac sprue or celiac disease and do not tolerate gluten. So it's a wonderful option for gluten sensitive and gluten intolerant patients as well. And then I think this needs no saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. It is distinct from white and brown rice, as you'll see in some of the tables I'll share with you momentarily. So quickly, a definition of nutrition from the Oxford Living Dictionary is the process of providing or obtaining the food necessary for health and growth. So we're talking about human health and growth. And this next slide should be no surprise to most of you. It's right off of the US FDA's website on the nutrition label, right? Nutrition labels have been changed a little bit recently, but you probably recognize the standard, serving size, calories, and then a breakdown of what I kind of generally call macronutrients and other components. So this is from their website. They have an example of frozen lasagna here. So you can see briefly that the total calories for a cup of the lasagna or the energy is 280. And then you can break down, just coming down here, for example, to dietary fiber, 4 grams in that serving. And then I draw your attention to this right column here in the lavender, the daily value guide. That's essentially telling the consumer how much of your recommended daily amount are you getting in this serving. And most of you know this, but that's just a general guideline. It's based on a 2,000 calorie diet a day, 2,000 calorie a day diet, which may or may not be appropriate for everyone. Many of us should be on less than that. Some of us with more robust, active lifestyle or growing may be higher. So the daily value or the recommended daily value is varies depending what we're talking about, right? So if we're talking about saturated fat, hey, you certainly don't have to meet that value. And if you go over it, it's less desirable. So you want to probably stay under that. But things like fiber, in this case, if you go over that recommended 28 grams, it may actually confer potentially more health benefit. So just to refresh your memory, how to read a food label. And then here, strikingly, it was actually kind of hard to find a nutrition fact sheet, food label for canoe harvested rice. I actually found this one off of Amazon's website for a brand of canoe harvested rice. So this is 1 cup of cooked rice, what a person might typically have. And you can see here that, it talks you through what I promised you we'd share, which is the kind of the breakdown. So it's 166 calories, not terribly high calorie, pretty low fat, only 1 gram, no cholesterol, which would be expected because it's a plant food source, very low sodium. And then you see the breakdown of the carbohydrates and fiber, sugar here, and protein. And I've got this blue arrow here just to tuck away in your head that protein amount. And then also, interestingly, even a little bit of iron there to look at. So as I move to this next slide, hopefully I can do that. Let me see. This table is, if you can reframe your thinking, now we're talking actually about 100 grams of uncooked rice. So this time it's uncooked, so it doesn't have quite the moisture content, which would be about a half a cup of raw rice. And so what's important here is just kind of scan across with your eye, the wild rice, then the white rice is in the second column, and then brown rice. And as you look across, you can see energy-wise, they're fairly comparable. But then you get to protein, and the wild rice is strikingly higher in protein content, as I alluded to earlier. Lipids or fats, it sort of sits in the middle. It's lower than brown, but higher than white. Carbohydrates, pretty comparable to the other rices. But dietary fiber, again, here's where you sort of see this advantage. And so to me, the take-home points here would be that wild rice is sort of a standout against the other macronutrients in both protein and dietary fiber, which is good to note. So let's see, I think I jumped ahead. Okay, so this is another separate table now. It looks very similar to the earlier one, but this one is looking at lipids, which you can think of as fats if you're not familiar with that term. And what I'll talk you through here is we're comparing wild rice just to brown rice. The total lipids, it's a little bit less total fat here, but what I'll bring your attention to is the omega-3 fatty acid percentage and the omega-6. So when you look at the omega-3 fatty acids, and many of you may be familiar with those, they've been in the news a lot. There's a ton of interest in omega-3s as being cardioprotective. And you see that the wild rice has quite a bit higher percentage than the brown rice, almost 20 to 1 or 10 to 1 to 20 to 1. And so that's what I want to bring up here is, and this is admittedly a gross oversimplification. The complexities of fatty acid metabolism and physiology is really complicated. But if you don't mind, for our purposes, on the left, you have omega-6 fatty acids. They're in red. And if you could think of them, this isn't fair, but think of them as bad. Okay, they're not bad, but they tend to lead to things ultimately that cause increased inflammation and vasoconstriction, which can increase blood pressure and increase tightness of the vasculature. And then on the right here, your omega-3s in the blue, vasodilation, so opening or relaxing, lowering blood pressure and resolving inflammation. So again, omega-6 kind of bad, omega-3 good. It's a gross oversimplification, but for our purposes, kind of helpful. And again, revisiting that table that I showed you moments ago, you can see if we do a ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 comparing, it's almost 1 to 1 for the wild rice, but much higher proportion of omega-6 in the brown rice to the omega-3. So this to me is a very favorable thing. You've got a higher proportion of the protective omega-3s. So something to keep in mind. Then as we look at wild rice, other wonderful features of its profile, we see that wild rice is fairly rich in the B vitamins, and that's what this table is intended to show. As you look at vitamin A, now this table is kind of comparing some other cereals as well. You've got oats and wheat and things. Vitamin A, nobody's really giving you a great supply of that except for our corn there. But then as you move across in the thiamine or B1, fairly comparable. But when you get to riboflavin or B2 and niacin, B3, the wild rice is significantly higher than most of the others. So again, just a really nice profile to tuck in your head that the B vitamins, particularly B2 and B3, are a nice source in the Manoomin. Okay. So to summarize, and I think this is sort of the take home part of our talk here, wild rice is a healthy food. It's pretty low fat. It's only about 1% of it is fat. And the fat that it has a very favorable profile, healthy fats, if you will. It's a very low sodium or low salt food. It has nearly double the protein of brown or white rice. It's got a good source of dietary fiber, which we'll touch on a little bit later, but fiber has been implicated in protective effects, even against important things like colon cancer, and that it's a natural source of B vitamins. So, and you saw earlier, even that slide showed that it has a little bit of iron in it too. So it's really quite a healthy food. Abby, I see that you've tucked back on. Is there a question or a comment?
Not yet. I don't know. I came back on, but you had somebody to look at.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so as promised, we were going to talk a little bit about the health benefits of wild rice. And I think even though this is not the focus of my presentation today, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the vast traditional indigenous knowledge of this topic. Wild rice in not just its health effects, but its ecology and its contribution to not only physical health, but mental health, spiritual health, community health of traditional indigenous peoples in the area. So my focus today is more to talk what we know from Western scientific models, more focused type of studies where you're hypothesis testing and trying to establish mechanisms of how things might work. So we're going to take a look at animal models mostly, because unfortunately, we really don't have any data from human studies. So what we'll start with here is actually a study that I found really interesting from 2013, so it's getting a little bit dated, but it's a mouse model. And the mice they choose often in these studies, I should tell you, are often sort of front-loaded to have problems with their blood vessels and their handling of cholesterol and things like that. So we're really looking at a diseased model that it tries to mimic hardening of the arteries in humans. And so this study actually looked at the ability of locally grown rice to slow down the hardening of the arteries process in these mice, excuse me. And I have locally grown in quotes because I think it's important to share with you all that sometimes when you're reading the scientific literature, it can actually be tricky to determine just exactly what kind of wild rice was used in the study. Locally grown wild rice is how it's described. And to me, that suggests that it's lake harvested, canoe harvested, but it doesn't specifically say that it's not cultivated. So I'm going to assume that this was lake harvested rice, but it can be in many of these studies I'm going to share with you. It can actually be hard to be certain. So most of you have heard of atherosclerosis or hardening of the arteries. Sadly, it can lead to heart attacks and strokes and lead to what we call heart disease, which is the #1 killer of Americans in our time. So very common, unfortunately, it's the buildup of what we call plaque, and you can sort of see that yellowish material building up over time in the arteries, and then sometimes something bad happens to that plaque, it breaks apart, a blood clot forms to heal it, and then you suddenly blocked that artery, which can lead you to a catastrophic heart attack or stroke. I've chosen to put these cross-sectional pictures in here because I'm going to show you some cross-sectional findings. But if you imagine, of course, that we take this normal healthy artery on top, look at it in cross-section, it's opening or lumen is wide, the blood has plenty of room to flow. But the cross-section of the diseased artery has sort of like the same stuff we worry about in our pipes at home. It has some atherosclerotic buildup, this fatty plaque, and the area for blood to flow through is more limited. So sliding into this picture, this is actually a human artery. I borrowed it from a colleague, not the artery, but the picture. And this, you can see the sort of oblong shape of the artery, and then my blue arrows here are added, and that's the plaque, the buildup within the artery wall. Abnormal, problematic, and can lead to, as I said, heart attacks and strokes. So we go back to our study that I mentioned, and I just want to walk you, I know this is a pretty busy slide, but I just want to walk you through the findings. Essentially, panels A, B, and C were in male rodents, and A was fed the sort of high-fat control diet. You can see this red arrow indicating, just like the picture earlier, kind of a buildup in the artery wall. So here's the artery buildup in the wall. B was the group that was fed the white rice. And again, we are seeing this buildup in the wall. But C is the wild rice group. And it's denoted by this sort of curved arrow that you're really not seeing much buildup in this wall. So as you pan your eyes across, A is the high-fat diet, B is the high-fat diet with white rice, and then now with the wild rice, you're just not seeing as much buildup. Very similar situation for D, E, and F, except these are female rodents. And so again, you're seeing the red arrow indicating the buildup, red arrow indicating the buildup of the white rice fed female rodents, and then now in the wild rice component, much less. So really intriguing. I mean, it's true that we're not rodents, but if you could have, this is the sort of stuff in my world, you say, oh, gee, this is what happens when you took Lipitor, or you had great blood pressure control, or something like that. So really encouraging. And for those of you that like graphs instead of pictures, this is the same data basically showing in the male mice, and then in the females. The black bar is the wild rice diet, and it is significantly different and lower for the atherosclerotic lesion size, so the square millimeter size. They're basically telling us the same thing as that earlier slide. a lot less buildup in the artery. This happened to be the aorta of the mice, big vessel. So super exciting, right? I mean, gosh, the main difference is feeding them wild rice. We didn't see the effect with white rice. So really an exciting finding. Another study, a separate study published, also showed similar things. This time they fed wild rice plus some phytosterols, some other beneficial or health promoting plant compounds. And they again saw some findings that are suggestive of cardiovascular benefit, lower cholesterol, and increased fecal cholesterol. So basically, to be crass, they were pooping out the cholesterol. But this is actually how some of our own human cholesterol drugs work. They try and get the cholesterol out excreted in the stool. So again, encouraging finding here. And you can sort of see I'm building on a theme. A lot of these same researchers are doing similar studies, publishing year after year. This one I think is important. Essentially, we're looking at those same mice again being fed white rice or wild rice or a controlled diet. And what we saw is strikingly with the white rice, more pro-inflammatory activity. And there's a host of markers that they were measuring to look at inflammation. But with the wild rice, they actually saw decreased in inflammatory activity. And this is their proposed mechanism of why we saw what we saw in the blood vessels, because the wild rice may be beneficial with some of that anti-inflammatory effect. So it relates a little bit to what I was telling you earlier too about the omega-3 fatty acids, all of these things contributing to a more healthful impact on the body. So this is a busy slide, but essentially it summarizes what I've been talking about here, this buildup of hardening of the arteries in this vessel, as you see over time, and really the blue arrow is where we want to intervene, right? We want to do things before we have the buildup, before we have the plaque in the artery. And so what I'm presenting to you today is that a diet rich in wild rice may be that type of intervention. We don't know, we don't have human trials. Everything I've told you is in a rodent model, but it's very exciting to think that something like this could have such a positive effect. So let's talk a little bit. I'm transitioning here. I know it seems like, oh, another rodent study, but this was a rat study almost 10 years ago. It's similar to the others in that they also saw some benefits with fats and fatty acids and a hormone associated with obesity called leptin. But why I put it in here is it's also taking us down the road that consumption of wild rice is also going to help our metabolic processes, things that when they're off balance can lead to metabolic syndrome and diabetes. So again, another feeding study there. Some of you may be familiar with this condition, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. It has actually overtaken alcohol-related liver disease as the most common form of chronic liver disease in the US. It's very common, unfortunately, where it's unrelated to alcohol intake. You just have a buildup of fat in the liver. It's becoming more common, unfortunately, and it has real connections to obesity and metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes. It sort of travels together in a complex kind of metabolic relationship. In some cases, it can lead to liver inflammation and even scarring and liver failure. So it can be very serious. And notably, there are no approved medicines to treat it. The treatment is primarily lifestyle modification with changing diet, increasing activity, losing weight. So you can see that this is setting the stage for yet another advantage of wild rice. I'd like to thank my colleague, Dr. Gallagher here, who shared some of our findings with us. But essentially, these were two different studies, but I'll talk you through the take-home point is that we used a controlled diet, then a higher fat diet. So the control diet here is the blue bar on the far left, then a higher fat diet in the red bar, and then the higher fat diet with wild rice is the green bar in the graph on the left. And you can see that, so even when you're eating a higher fat diet, if you're a rat, having the wild rice on board, eating that as part of your diet was protective and helped to lower that liver fat. And sort of a similar finding, if you will, on the right panel there, where you had a high fat diet, and then both brown rice and the wild rice seemed to lower that. So really encouraging finding. Animal model, but super exciting for the potential for wild rice to help mitigate some of the harms of a high fat diet.
Dr. Arnello, we had a couple questions. I thought now
Oh,
would be a decent time to bring them up.
I think I do. Yes.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
Dan, do you want to do one of them? You can do David's, and then I'll shoot one as well.
Okay, let's start with Paige Van Pelt's first. I think it's more on the topic of what was just discussed.
Oh yeah, I didn't even see that one. Go for it.
So
Okay.
that question is, Dr. Arnello, is there any data relating to the metabolizing of carbs in wild rice as opposed to that of brown and white rice?
Great question. I don't know of any, and I'm assuming that you're open to all models, animal and human. I know there's nothing in human that I've been able to see. Metabolizing up carbohydrates in wild rice as opposed to brown and white rice. I think what Paige might be getting at is the idea of a glycemic index, maybe, and how quickly the carbohydrates are broken down. I'm going to have to say I don't know. I'm not aware of any. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but I think it's a great question. In terms of the quick release of sugars and the kind of glycemic response, I'd have to do a little digging to really answer that well. And then in a follow-up comment, I've seen white rice raise my triglycerides. Yes. This is really a great question, and I have a feeling there's probably some people on this call that have more expertise than I do about it. But really, it's that complexity of the carbohydrates, the fiber, the absorption, really fairly complex. So I'm not surprised that you're seeing that with the white rice kind of coming quickly with the triglycerides, not unexpected. Yeah, so that's great. And I do see David Abaz's excellent question, and it does come up a little bit later, so I'll come back to that.
And there's one other, why animals and not human trials as research? Is it just shorter lifespans and you see results faster? Just easy, like why? Just is there a
right? There's probably multiple answers to that. There's the practical, right, that you can control for a lot of things. You can sort of, some of these feeding studies are 20 weeks. So you're talking, what, 4 months and you have your findings. Human feeding studies are expensive, as are animal studies, but they're notoriously tricky, right? You've got to make sure that people are following what you say, and it's hard to get people to eat exactly what you want for months and months. But the other piece that I'll throw in, and this is just my editorial comment, is when you have something like lake harvested rice, right? You don't have big, huge industry. You know, Kellogg isn't marketing a new product to you. So you just don't have a lot of finance to say, let's look at this, let's promote this, because it may not be part of the larger, agricultural food models. Again, that's my personal opinion, is, where does funding for nutrition studies come from? So that's why this work is pretty exciting to me, because it is a, local food that is fairly accessible to a lot of people, and of course needs processing, which is where the Finland Food Chain Project comes in so well. But so that would be my answer. Our hope, with that said, you can see where I'm going. I'm super hopeful that we will be able to do some human studies someday, because I think that will really answer some important questions. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Continue questions in the chat, everyone, or the Q&A. I've got them both open, so I'm ready this time. We've got to go.
Yeah. Oh yes, this is a perfect comment Paige is making. Colon cancer also of particular interest with Lynch syndrome, which is a syndrome, kind of a genetic syndrome, for those who haven't heard of it, that can predispose a person to malignancies in the colon and elsewhere. So this is some preliminary data I'm sharing. A graduate student actually did this work in Dr. Gallagher's lab. And the overarching conclusion I would like you to leave with is more study is needed to really look at colon cancer and wild rice, but it certainly makes sense. We know that other high fiber foods and various things have had some benefit. And so this particular study looked at a biochemical marker, DCLK1, and for your purposes, just think of that as the higher that is, that's bad news, more tendency towards malignancy. And so you can see on this diagram here that the more DCLK1 immunostaining, the higher the level. And so this basal diet, it was sort of 15. And then the total Western diet, which is basically a diet that's more like what humans in America eat, higher fat, you saw higher DCLK1, which is not a surprise, right? Because we're worried these higher fat diets can increase risk of colon cancer. But what's exciting is that crimson bar basically showing that that it was the DCLK1 was knocked down when you added the wild rice to the higher fat diet. So again, very similar theme. Hopefully you're coming away with this. Is she saying that again? That, you know, as a physician, I love the idea that it's something that can be helpful without people have to completely change what they're doing. They can just add it to what they're doing. So in summary, to Paige's point and the other questions raised, human studies are needed. There's limitations of what you can conclude when you're using mice and rats. But based on these rodent models, we see really nice potential that a diet consuming Manoomin or wild rice may reduce your risk of hardening of the arteries and its attendant diseases of stroke, heart attack, and the like. That it reduces fat accumulation in the liver and maybe some benefits there for liver and other metabolic issues. And then some early data suggesting it may be protective against colon cancer as well. So let's talk briefly about ongoing nutritional research. The first bullet point here is environmental influences, and this is a study that I'm just delighted to be part of. It's called Manoomin Minds, and it's going on. We just started it, and essentially what we're trying to look at is what about the growth environment of the wild rice may or may not influence its nutritional profile. So what's happening in the sediment by its roots, in the water column, things like the microbiome around the roots, things like the sulfate in the water. So we're actually out now collecting water and sediment and rice samples, and hopefully pairing up with our colleagues in the cities to do some nutritional analysis. So stay tuned. Happy to come back and report what we find from that in a few years. But this diagram here is actually a graphic one of my colleagues created, sort of how I conceptualize the project, that we really want to look at the geography and the growth conditions and how that impacts the outcome of the nutrition of the rice. And then the other piece I mentioned is continued study of risk reduction for cancer, cardiovascular, and metabolic disorders, because these disorders are so prevalent in our American population that really hoping to continue partnerships so we can really figure out what wild rice can do and then how it does it. To Paige's question about the carbohydrate metabolism, what's happening? Why is it helpful to eat it? And these are David Abbas's question, which I just love. It's come up in a lot of conversations I've had. How does this wild rice compare to paddy rice? And I'm unaware of any head-to-head studies. Often, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes it's tricky to know when you're looking at a nutritional analysis, you know, what kind of rice were they using? Not everyone is even aware of the distinction between cultivated rice or paddy rice and lake harvested or natural stands of rice. So this is a question that I've heard from band members, tribal members. I've heard it from other folks. Hearing it today is exciting, and perhaps worth a future study as well, you know, to see, are they more similar to each other in benefit, or are there interesting differences between the two? The other things I'll just throw out to the audience to think about, maybe areas of interest that they have, is what is the role of accompanying foods and preparation techniques, right? Because typically this food wasn't always eaten by itself. So we know there's sometimes nutritional additive things. The classic example is iron and vitamin C. I think, you know, when you have those together, the acid allows the iron absorption to improve. So are there other ways that the benefits of wild rice are amplified depending how you prepare it or what you eat with it? So we just don't know. So it's an area for study. Many of you, if you're nutrition enthusiasts who are listening to this, are following this debate now in nutrition and medicine. Is plant-derived protein better than animal-derived protein, and how might wild rice protein fit into that? I'm particularly interested in maybe these differences between the varietals I mentioned early on, that these are natural rice stands, but there's some variety between them, and maybe they just naturally differ based on various things we don't know. And then here's where the Wild Rice Project comes in. Really not a lot's known about the impact of harvesting activity on health, right? It's hard work, very hard work. And not just the canoe harvesting, but the hauling and then the traditional finishing the rice. And so really would be interested sometime to do even kind of activity monitor studies to see what is the caloric output or what kind of injuries do people have when they're doing this. There's a lot to look at in terms of that. And then lastly, you know, very relevant to what Finland's working on is what's the influence of various processing methods on the nutritional outcome and that sort of thing. So those are just some future questions that I had. I certainly am going to guess your audience members have some interesting ideas too. So I would invite them. I'm always happy to talk about Manoomin, and if you and your team have projects or ideas where we can collaborate, I'm always eager to think about that. I'd like to close with a quote that really says it all. I learned this quote from my friend and colleague, Nancy Schultz, who said, "Manoomin is a superfood and it's sacred too." And really, if you take nothing from this talk today, but this quote, I will be happy. It really is a superfood and it is sacred too. I have a lot of people to thank. I'll just go quickly. Obviously, Finland Food Chain for inviting me, and you, Abby, and Cindy Hale, the Abazes. And the next set of folks are all people who've taught me so much about Manoomin and wild rice. The Fond du Lac folks and 1854 Treaty Authority experts, and my wonderful colleagues at the university, my colleague Melissa Walls, and then lastly, my husband and son, who are the people that took me ricing for the first time. So I have to acknowledge them too. So a big thank you to all of you, because you've all been my teachers, and I really am grateful for that. A few readings if you're really inspired. And then just the final invitation to reach out to me anytime. If you have thoughts or comments, criticisms, ideas, I'd be welcome to hear them. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Seriously, I learned a lot. I honestly didn't know really anything about, I didn't know that wild rice had iron in it. That was very surprising to me. One thing, so you had mentioned in one of our previous discussions, the impact of like the water quality and the location on the nutrition of wild rice. Have you even, like, is that one of the, is that even a thing? Or is that something that is also super unanswered and you have no idea? I was just curious about that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it sort of touches on that Manoomin Mines project that I was talking about. Really came out of a lot of discussions with tribal nations and environmental groups who are concerned about lots of things that are deleterious to rice, as you mentioned: climate change, severe weather events, invasive species, and even the concern of potential loading of environmental contaminants such as sulfate levels and things. And so there was this discussion about all of these things and how can we look at that. And we know from existing research done by some folks, really excellent science done here in the Duluth area with the Fond du Lac tribe, that we know that, for example, growth of the plant in a sulfate environment is harmful for the plant's vitality and reproductive capacity. So we do know certain things about environments that can be harmful to the plant, but what we just didn't happen to look at the nutrition. And I have to say, this was not my idea. It's actually the idea of a great scientist, John Pastor, who said, "Well, we should look at the nutrition and see that these things that harm the plant in other ways harm the seed." And we don't know, because maybe the plant puts everything it's got into that seed. It's like, hey, I'm having a tough time here, but here's my seed and I want it to survive. Or does it also suffer and not be able to store the carbohydrates and proteins that the seed needs to survive? So that's a really long answer to your question, Abby. But I think, it's really tough when you start to do this kind of science that goes across disciplines, right? Because you've got a little bit of ecology there, and then sort of geochemistry, and which is, yeah, it's tough, but it's exciting. You kind of have to harvest, collect the right expertise in the room, and groups like yours who are out harvesting, who are noticing things, who make observations, and who are consuming wild rice are also a really important resource for science, because you're firsthand observers and you're noticing it. So that's really important, the work you're all doing out there.
Yeah, definitely. And then Paige Van Pelt had another question, and I might actually answer this one. How is the drought affecting the rice this year? So we can transition over to that. So the rice itself is doing just fine from what I've heard and what I've seen. The rice is coming up in great numbers. However, due to the drought, the water levels are very low. And so getting to the rice has been very interesting this year. I was talking at the Finland Farmers Market last night with one of the vendors there, and he was saying that in previous drought years, and he expects it again this year, he has seen somebody that made snowshoes to walk on the false bottom that the rice provides, and had kind of a hoop on them instead of a canoe, so that they could walk out onto the lake. And I would not encourage that. It sounds very dangerous. But yes, so the drought, not so much affecting the rice. It is affecting the rice some. It's starting to become ripe and ready to harvest earlier in the year than we've seen previous years. But yeah, the water levels are just really low. And so a lot of people are choosing to harvest in the kind of mouths and openings of rivers in those areas. But I think it'll be a great opportunity for the rice to recoup from some overharvesting that has happened in previous years. So some spots that harvesters can't necessarily get to this year will then drop all those seeds, and it'll come up in abundance next year. So blessing and a curse for sure. If that answers your question, Paige, thank you for asking. And yeah, let's see, any other questions? I'm not seeing any other questions.
I had a question regarding the manipulation of wild rice as an ingredient, in terms of how the breakdown of nutrients can be consumed by humans or mice, in terms of eating wild rice as a whole kernel that's boiled and cooked that way, versus grinding it into a flour, consuming it like that, making it into a bread or a pancake or something else. Versus I've also heard that you can cook wild rice very similar to popcorn, even pop the kernels in a way that they will create little crunchy kernels that you can eat. I'm wondering if there are different impacts in terms of nutritional value and how it's consumed in those different formats.
Well, I really love that question, and it's an easy answer for me is I don't know. However, I'm not a food scientist either, and it's something, if you're really interested, I could do a little digging, because I think there has probably been a lot of interest in those various ways of modifying and using rice flour, as you mentioned, and all kinds of things. What I often see a lot of people have, what you'll see if I was on Amazon looking for that food label, so often it's, Manoomin, or not even Manoomin, patty rice mixed with white rice, or mixed, it's this mixture. So, which is not what your question is, but it's really interesting. Almost, I would love to know how many people really are even just eating lake harvested rice in all the forms you mentioned, which is a separate question. But, there may be some food scientists in Minnesota or Wisconsin, Michigan, who might have those answers. My my uninformed answer is I don't think it would change a lot. If you're still having the components of the food. Our stomach kind of mashes stuff up right there in our small intestine. So I don't imagine, my uneducated answer is I don't imagine that you'd see a lot of deviation from the nutritional value of it. But
Yeah, thank you. Another modality I just thought of was I've seen wild rice in cans, and wondering what that would be like compared to dried wild rice that is cooked. I know there are some nutritional differences in terms of canned vegetables, canned legumes compared to the dried versions. I'm wondering if that would be similar for wild rice.
right, that's a good question. And I think, and I'd have to go, to the supermarket aisle. I know exactly what you're talking about. I think the wild rice that's often in the can is patty rice. I don't think I've ever seen it be made out of, lake harvested rice. And that's one of those things as a physician, I kind of weigh, even if it's not as good, and you're right, canned food often maybe doesn't retain a lot of its values in terms of nutrition. If it helps people to eat it, because I think it's all cooked, right? You just kind of dump it out of the can and use it. If it promotes people using it, then maybe the benefit outweighs potentially a little bit of loss. But I don't know the answer. Those are really good questions of where the nutrition is the best. I see another question in that is really for kind of a ecologist person, not me, but how are the invasive species affecting the rice? I can only echo from what I've heard resource managers and folks who really know the ecology of wild rice is that quite a few species are impacting, and there's pickerelweed or pickleweed is the one that I hear people talk about kind of growing over. But I definitely think that invasive species are a problem because, whatever's down to in the sediment stealing the nutrients quicker from the rice can be a problem for the rice. Yeah.
Yeah, and also the starry stonewort and other milfoils like that. I've heard, to kind of echo off of you, I've also heard that people are using wild rice as a preventative measure to restore water after starry stonewort has taken over. So I'm not, that's just like what I've heard through the pipeline. So I'm not super sure, but that could also be a great question page. So that could be a great, something
interesting.
to look
into. And something that occurs to me talking to this group, really I've talked primarily about, the diseases that I see as a family doc and stuff, but a lot of what we see is what we call dysthymia or sadness, depression, spiritual isolation. And I love what your group is doing in terms of the mentorship and the apprenticeship, because I didn't talk about any of those things. The tribe's health impact assessment talks actually quite a bit about community and belonging and mental health and spiritual health that come from all of the direct activities around harvesting, but also the indirect activities later while rice is gifted or used in ceremony and things like that. And to your point about, community consumption and incorporating rice into community events and creative recipes, I think all of those things contribute to health. And so I've just given you sort of this super narrow little chunk of it, but there's certainly a lot more to human health than just arteries and livers. Those are important, but wild rice has a lot of potential in other areas too that I didn't necessarily feature in the talk itself. I just want to mention.
Yeah, I think if you need people to do some research on, to do some tests on, I know that the northern Minnesota folks, both native and non-native, eat a lot of wild rice. So you definitely have a very great community up here that would be willing to help with that.
That's great. I would just change one word there. Instead of doing tests on you, I would say with you.
Yes.
We want to partner with you and maybe answer some of these great, questions that you have too, because, clearly we're kind of all churning in the same way about how this food and how this plant can be health promoting.
Yes. And then David Abaz would like to know, what is your favorite way to eat wild rice? Great question, David.
Oh yeah, right. What if she says she doesn't eat it? No,
Yeah.
this is not a setup. This actually just happened. We're trying to clear out our freezer, and my husband has some venison from last season, and he's making venison stroganoff with served on wild rice. So I have to say, the sour cream, venison's fairly healthy. It's not the healthiest way to eat it, but I think the venison stroganoff is one of my favorite ways. Also, sometimes as a breakfast kind of food. I'd be curious if people can put in the chat. I'd love to hear what their favorites are. But I think I like more the savory. I know some people have it as a sweet with cream or with maple syrup too. But yeah, I like it kind of as a savory meal.
Yeah, well, if while people are coming up with their favorite ways, if they want to put them in the chat, one thing that I recently learned that Dan was actually talking about is just putting it over heat and it pops like a corn kernel, and using that in place of croutons on a salad.
Oh,
It is delicious, and it just the flavor, the wild rice flavor is there, and it's just delicious. So something that I didn't even know you could do. And somebody was like, listen, you got to try this. And the glorious ways of northern Minnesota, folks, that's the way to go. But
yeah, I've never done that. Thank you for that tip. I'll have to try that. Kind of makes sense. Pop it kind of like that.
yeah.
I'm not seeing anybody putting their favorite way to
Yeah.
eat wild rice. How about you, David Abaz? I'd love to know your answer.
Dan says adding cooked wild rice to smoked turkey in a turkey salad. Ooh.
Yeah, that'd be good.
I need to start writing these down.
I tried to make wild rice, kind of incorporate it into cookies, and that was okay. And wild rice meatballs. I'm still experimenting myself, but
Yeah, something our project will be experimenting with when we get into the cooking portion of wild rice in the education. From Cindy Hale, actually, she provided us with a bag of wild rice flour. So it's just ground wild rice into a flour texture. And so baking with that and seeing how those properties really, how they change a baked good. And I'm really excited to see how that turns out. David Abaz says cheese veggie casserole.
ooh, I
Not a
like
hot
that.
dish, a casserole, apparently.
That does sound good because he has access to all those fresh vegetables too.
Mhm.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Right. Well, we are coming up on 6:30. I want to thank everybody for coming and for participating and asking questions. I want to thank you, Dr. Ornella, for the wonderful presentation. That was really awesome. And I know that we will be working together in the future. I can tell you right now, it's going to be great. And
Great.
I put our website and our Facebook page in the chat. So if anybody wants to know more information, Dr. Onella's slides and the recording of this presentation will be up on the website for you to look back and refer to if you want to rewatch it over and over again, as one does. Feel free to do so. And on our website, there's contact information for myself and other members of the team. If you have any questions about the project or want to get involved or want to learn more, feel free to shoot questions our way. So thank you so much for coming. And I wish you all a wonderful night and enjoy this rain and cool weather. It's a nice break from the dry heat. So it'll be great.
Thank you so much, and for all the good work you guys are doing at Finland Food Chain.
Thank you.